Good afternoon, friends and colleagues from the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies and the University of the Western Cape. My name is Andries de Tooy, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to yet another one of our webinars on the challenges and the issues and the questions facing those who are trying to survive at the margins of the capitalist economy here in Southern Africa in the time of the coronavirus. Until now, our discussions have focused very much on the economic implications of the pandemic and the pandemic response on people's ability to get food on the table, money in their pockets, on their economic survival, on the material issues they're facing. But the response to the pandemic does not only have economic dimensions, it's also a profoundly important political event involving a radical change in the relationships between states and the citizens and the subjects that they govern. We've seen, most obviously, a fundamental curtailment of our civil rights. We are no longer able to be where we want to move where we want to. Our ability to engage in economic activity has been curtailed. We've been told when we can exercise, where we can go, even what we can wear, or at least what we can buy to wear. And governments assure us that this is for our own good. But even if it is for our own good, what are the long-term implications for democracy in the societies that they live in? And what are the consequences for the management of the pandemic itself of a situation where people are treated not as citizens, but as subjects of administrative intervention, and sometimes even simply as objects of biomedical management? Here to talk with us in the studio, we have got three very interesting and exciting guests. Joining us from Khayelitsha is Tapelo Mohape, previously General Secretary of Abehlale Basemonjolo, now with Indifuna Nkwazi. Tapelo has been very involved in the community action networks that have sprung up to deal with the crisis of the pandemic. And he has witnessed at first hand the changing relationships between citizens and the government that is trying to protect, but also to control them. Also in the studio with us is my colleague, Philan Zamchia, a researcher at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies. Philani is a scholar of agrarian change and is also very interested in the political dimensions and the democratic dimensions of agrarian change. And we also with us in the studio have Fiona Anciano from Political Studies at the University of the Western Cape. Fiona is a researcher looking at the nature of democracy and the constitution of public authority in informal settings. And she's been looking at what's been happening to people's day-to-day experience of governance in informal settlements and in context of poverty in this time. So it's a very exciting and very interesting lineup. As before, we will have questions and answers between myself and our guests during the first half hour. Please leave your comments and your questions in the comment box on the YouTube screen in front of you, and we will try to deal with as many of these issues as we go along. So I'm going to begin not in South Africa, where we have tended to focus, but in Zimbabwe, a society where, while the pretense of democracy has perhaps worn rather thin, and where nonetheless we've seen a radical change in the nature and the style of government in the last month. Philan, what is your assessment of what's been happening, firstly, to Zimbabwean democracy, such as it is in this time, and how has government gone about engaging with citizens during the corona crisis?
Thank you, Andries, and thanks everybody as we try to reason together on this very important topic. The context is that since gaining independence in 1980, the Zimbabwean ruling elite has been debating on whether to let live or to let die democratic politics and its critical citizens. but they've realized that a let die approach delegitimizes the state heavily. COVID-19 then becomes a natural legitimating tool within this context. Let me say that Zimbabwe is not an exception, though. Autocrats across the world are taking this route. So, what is the state of the pandemic in Zimbabwe today? Just to give a background. As of 2 days ago, 12,598 citizens had been test screened for the virus. That is about 0.09% of the population, and 10,498, which is about 0.08% of the population, have undergone some PCR diagnostic tests. 37 have tested negative, which signifies a low infection rate. Unfortunately, 4 have died. But alongside this, I've observed a very hidden authoritarian agenda by the ruling elite. First, there has been an assault on freedom of expression. Section 61 of the Zimbabwean Constitution is very clear that there should be freedom of expression and freedom of the press. The government gazetted the Public Health COVID-19 Regulations 2020, and Section 14 of those regulations reads that those who communicate or publish falsehoods are liable to a sentence of 20 years in jail. 20 years is a lifetime in a country where life expectancy is 36 years. It is actually to let die citizens. And alongside this, 12 journalists have already been attacked. The second issue is a surge in human rights violations committed by soldiers and the police who have been deployed to monitor compliance with the COVID-19 regulations. As of 48 hours ago, 26,398 citizens had been arrested. That is about 0.2% of the population, far more than the people who have been tested for the virus. So we can actually see where scarce state resources are going. They are going towards security measures instead of public health to save life. And this does not augur well, especially if we consider that the soldiers have been committing atrocities against human rights. 15 to 17 April 2020 was a very dark period for citizens, especially in Bulawayo. The army terrorized people in Ngeta 9, in Ngeta 7, just randomly. And it has been very bad. All this with immunity. So the relationship between the state and the citizens hasn't been very well. And these citizens are being sent to prison. And we know that prisons are highly infectious, you know, especially also in a context where the Zimbabwe prison system has a carrying capacity of 17,000 and already has more than 20,000 inputs. And the third aspect of concern has been the destruction of poor people's properties, their marketing stores and their assets in the informal sector. Never mind that Zimbabwe has the largest informal economy in Africa and the second largest in the world. Section 71 of the Zimbabwean Constitution actually protects property, but poor people's property is never really protected by the law and is not recognized as real property by the ruling elite. If you look at the government circular number 3 of 2020, it was very clear that the government was going to take advantage of COVID-19 to clean up the informal sector and also to reallocate market stores to those citizens who are deemed loyal to the ruling party. And we have also seen that within this matrix, the police have confiscated and banned fruits and vegetables that belong to poor vendors who are women. The majority of them are women trying to take care of their families. Also, this is absurd in a context where 7.7 million of the population, which is almost half, is in need of food aid, according to the United Nations rapporteur on the right to food. And then the fourth aspect that has really been worrying on the ground is this attempt to emasculate political opponents under COVID-19. Just a day after the lockdown was announced, the Supreme Court ruled that Nelson Chamisa, who is the president of the largest opposition political party, the Movement for Democratic Change, was no longer the de jure president of the MDC. I'm not getting into the legal merits of that case, but my point is the timing ensured that there was no urgent and coordinated and effective response by the opposition. Alongside that, other political opponents who have criticized President Emmerson Mnangagwa's COVID-19 response have also been arrested. Then the fifth thing has been the partisan distribution of food aid that is meant for vulnerable families. This has actually left women and children to bear the brunt on their own. But quickly, how have citizens responded? Initially, during the first days of the lockdown, citizens have been trying to comply. But as each day passes, they are becoming less able to comply socially, politically, and economically. So one, we have seen a rise in lawfare, where the citizens are taking the government to court to ensure that soldiers respect human dignity, to ensure that journalists are able to function independently, to ensure that the frontline health workers are able to get protective equipment. Then, to sustain their livelihoods, the citizens have been walking to town in the absence of public transport. In the rural areas, people are running grinding mills at night. Actually, there's some form of midnight economy that is emerging. People are also opening salons and barber shops clandestinely, and they are making sure that tuck shops are also operating underground. Beer brewing and beer consumption is also ongoing. People do not see this as open defiance, but as a matter of necessity, because they want to live and they don't want to die. But also there's a conception that people are just sitting, doing nothing and waiting to die from COVID-19. That is far from it. In the villages, women are actually sewing some face masks from their zambias. That is the wrapping cloth that women use. And there are also instances where people are taking dosages of herbs so that they boost their immune system, relying on local knowledge. And all these are kind of localized responses. Even in the education sector, for example, in Mbizo, Kwekwe, there are community schools that are emerging. In Mbizo Township, I observed that these classrooms, they are run at homes. They usually have 4 learners. They don't take more than 8 learners. When they are learning, they wear masks. They sit about 1 meter apart, and they are privileged that they can be able to wash their hands. There are volunteers from the communities actually teaching these kids. So it's not like people do not have agency. I've spoken about this kind of everyday forms of reactions, responses that are kind of driven by the need for material benefits. But just as of yesterday, we have seen that there are also now overt protests. The MDC young activists, they went on the streets yesterday, and they were clearly demanding that the state must end its assault on democracy and civil liberties under the guise of dealing with coronavirus. 3 young women have been arrested, and the state is refusing to reveal their whereabouts. They all hold important positions within the Movement for Democratic Change. The puzzle here is when to let live is to let die. Thank you.
Thank you, Pilani, for that very powerful picture of a context where the state is much more overtly authoritarian than we are used to thinking about in South Africa, and also talking to us about the resilience and the agency of people in civil society. Yesterday, it was our privilege as South Africans to be on the receiving end of yet another missive from our president, where we were reassured about the importance of on the state, that it was open to being criticized, that it acknowledged that it was making mistakes. Many South Africans are left wondering, what does that actually mean in practice, and are we going to see any real changes to aspects of the lockdown that many of us felt are arbitrary or counterproductive? But to give us a view from the streets of Khayelitsha is where we have Tapelo Mohapi. Tapelo, what is your view been, and what have you seen about how the state has dealt with people, how people have dealt with the organs of government? How do people feel about their status as citizens in this Republic of South Africa of ours?
Thank you very much to Plus. Thank you very much to UWC. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you very much for also not including researchers and doctors and academics, but also learning from people who are actually seeing the plight of the people on the ground. The picture is not that good on the ground. Things are not looking as good as we had hoped to have them. And our story may not be similar to that of Zimbabwe, where there is complete violence and brutality, and there are no voices that are listened of the people on the ground. Here, at least in South Africa, we have social movements, and not only they are strong, their voice is strong, but in the fact that there is a constitution that goes together with it, and there are somehow accountability that a state that is violent can be held accountable for that. So we know that there's a case of a family man who was killed in Johannesburg as a result of the army's brutality, and that has been taken to court, and there's a task that is going to be, at least there is some response from the states, not as much. However, having said that, on the ground, what we have seen extreme poverty. We have seen a state that is very, very, very much detached from the realities on the ground. There seems to be a communication that is done at a national level, that is communicated at a provincial level, but does not get to the roots of the people on the ground, simply because the prior to the pandemics, I think what the pandemic has done, it has shown and revealed how our ANC-led government has not been on the ground more often.
Sorry, we have been having difficulty with Tapelo's audience. We're going to try to get him to reconnect with a better connection. So apologies for that interruption. While we wait for Tapelo to reconnect, I'd like to go to our third guest, Fiona. Fiona, you've been doing research with your informants and your colleagues in various informal settlements in Cape Town, asking them to keep lockdown diaries in which they record their day-to-day experiences of life under the corona crisis, and particularly you've been interested in their relationships with government and the nature of public authority. What have been some of the key insights and lessons that you can take away from your research?
Hi, thanks, Andres, and thanks for inviting me to talk today. Yeah, so I've been working with a great team, Sarah Jane Cooper-Knopp from the University of Edinburgh, and 3 of our own students at UWC, Meli Dube, Botemelo Papane, and Mfundo Madora. And we've been looking at what people are saying through our lockdown diaries, where we ask people every 2 days to answer a prompt. And we have 70 people across Cape Town that talk to us. And this is from a range of different settlement types: informal settlements, occupied hospitals, suburban, urban, RDP houses. And so we've been getting a really interesting sense of what people are saying and what's coming through in terms of how they are feeling about government policy, dealing with the lockdown, and all the implications of the corona crisis. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is how our respondents have responded to the issue of trust in government. So we asked them the prompts: do you trust the government more or less now? And if so, why or why not? And what was interesting is that the responses were actually almost split down the middle. Half of our diarists said they trust the government more than they ever have and have very high levels of trust. And the reasons for this were they're doing a good job, they're protecting us in the space of a crisis, we have good leadership, and they know what's best, and we feel like they're making some good decisions. Then the other half of our respondents said, no, actually, we don't trust the government at all. It's very low, our trust. And what's interesting here is that nobody sat on the fence. There was no one in between. All the respondents had very strong views, one way or the other. So those who said, no, we have very low trust, a lot of them initially started off with fairly high levels of trust. They were very pleased in the first few weeks with the leadership from the president. But we're seeing now that trust is shifting and changing. Many of them also always had low levels of trust in the government. They were never particularly ANC supporters, for example. So it's interesting to now think why, what are the reasons behind this polarization? And then if we actually look at those who feel the government are doing a bad job, what's coming out there is fascinating, because the same policy is getting completely polarized views by those who distrust the government. So some are saying the regulations are not strict enough, and some are saying the regulations are too strict. We have too much freedom, we don't have enough freedom. There is too much policing, there's not enough policing. And it's very interesting that this kind of polarization is permeating through society in so many different levels. So we sort of stop and ask ourselves, well, why? What's going on with citizens' views of the state and of government? And I think underpinning a lot of these responses is really a strong sense of fear and anxiety. And that is to be expected. This is an unprecedented crisis for us. We've never dealt with a medical pandemic in this way before, where we've had such strong state regulation and had lockdowns. So it's new and people are fearful. And what we're seeing then obviously is this fear then translates to ideas of what does it mean to be vulnerable? So if we look particularly at what's coming out of our diarists from informal settlements, occupied buildings, for example, those who are the most vulnerable are feeling the fear even more profoundly, because they are the ones who know that there isn't a security net for them. They don't have medical aid, they don't have private hospitals, they don't have opportunities to find a solution when things get really bad. And so that's translating into this real, what I would call a sort of paradox of citizenship, this desperate need for more state intervention, more states' responsibility, more state provision of security and protection, while at the same time acknowledging that they want their human rights to be upheld and protected. So there's a very interesting, and I think this comes in a particular context in South Africa, where we have obviously one of the highest levels of inequality in the world. The state can't deal now with structural inequality. This is not the time or the space. Opportunities are very limited. There are certain things that can happen, the social grants being expanded, perhaps more water and sanitation services being expanded, but generally our structural inequalities are very deep and very profound. So we have to think about that as the context and the background. But there is this desire for more protection. And this kind of paradox now hits citizens because they want this protection. They want to be good citizens. They want policing, but they don't want their policing to overstep the boundaries, but they need security. And so that's why I think, I wanted to sort of interrogate the notion of subject and citizen that we're talking about today, because maybe it's not that binary. Maybe it's not that divided between a subject and a citizen. There's this tension and this meshing between moving through both. And this paradox also, I think, plays in ways that we might not have predicted. I mean, Plan was mentioning that in Zimbabwe, citizens are now feeling less able to comply. He used those words. And I think that's part of the tension we're seeing here too, that we have many of our diarists saying, we want to wear a mask, we want to social distance, we can't. We need to somehow make some money so we can buy the mask. We need to go and get our SASSA grants, so we have to stand in a queue. So there's this tension. We want to be a good citizen, we can't be a good citizen. How do we do both? We want you to bring policing in the army to keep us safe, but we don't want you to abuse those powers. So I think there's an interesting, and I think this is not necessarily, while it's new in this context, I think it does talk a little bit as well to other issues that we have also thought about in terms of land invasion, for example, that have happened prior to COVID, where people need land, they need to live somewhere. It doesn't mean they're saying they don't want the state in their lives. They want the state to somehow have an ability to offer services, intervention, and support, but it doesn't mean that they want to be treated and abused by the state. So I'll leave it there for now, and we can go perhaps back to Tapelo, and I can answer many questions if anyone's interested in our lockdown diaries and other information we've had.
Thank you, Fiona. We're still trying. Tapelo, are you back? We were having difficulty with your sound, and we unfortunately had to interrupt you in midstream. Are you able to resume and give us the rest of your answer? Apologies for that interruption, by the way. Tapelo, you're muted. Tapelo, it may be that your headphones.
Are you able to hear me?
Now we heard you now. I think that your headphones are interfering with your sound. If you take the headphones off. Okay, we can hear you now.
Okay.
Okay, please continue.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yeah, now we can hear you loud and clear.
Is Pilane all the way from Zim can hear me from there? Okay, thank you very much. Sorry about that technology. Right now I'm in the, I've just attended okay, thank you very much. As I was saying, thank you, Pilane, for the information that we get from our friends from Zimbabwe. I think as much as you are facing the hardship that you are facing where you are, we are also experiencing the same, but ours is nothing compared to the brutality of the army, brutality of the law enforcement in your country. Yes, of course, we've had when the lockdown started, where a family man was killed in Johannesburg by police. I mean, by the army. However, that is currently in court, and there's some accountability that is going there, which is something that in Zimbabwe it is difficult to get, where justice is at the end of the day is served. I think part of the work that has been done here in South Africa is the voices of the civil society, the voices of social movement on the ground. But having said that, COVID-19 has somehow revealed to us how the state has been detached from the realities of the people on the ground. We have seen when the National Lockdown Command Council was in play, who announced the fact that evictions must be suspended during this period of time where people are facing this pandemic and the crisis in the country. We are currently more than 12,000 people who are infected with the virus at this point in time. 290 people have lost their lives, and very few people have recovered. As I'm sitting right now in the offices of the Social Justice Coalition, which is a social movement based in Khayelitsha, which we also work with as Indifunukwazi, looking outside the window from the boardroom from our meeting, I'm seeing a lot of people in the Khayelitsha Mall who are not social distancing, who walk around without their mask. But there are many crises that we have faced. For instance, where we had to respond as a movement to issues in Empolweni, which is a community that was facing evictions brutally from the City of Cape Town's law enforcement as well as the South African police services. People were evicted, rendered homeless, regardless, disregarding the call rather by the national government to halt the evictions during this time. However, social movement have come out through the Legal Resource Center. We've managed to actually get an interdict that prevented the municipality from rendering people homeless. And as we speak now, people are actually back into their homes. The same cannot be said about people in Johannesburg, where the city of Johannesburg is also doing the same, evicting people under these difficult times. The same cannot be said about people who have been shot with live ammunition, who have been evicted, rendered on a countless time by the eThekwini municipality in Durban. So that we see these brutalities and evictions that are taking place during this time of this crisis time. But also what the response by the young activists in Khayelitsha, in Cape Town, and an organization that was going to tackling the issues with regard to COVID-19, Cape Town Together. We have the Community Action Network from the CBDs. We have networks in Khayelitsha as well. Just yesterday, we were assisting old age people who were outside the SASA a building, who wanted to be first in the queue because the department is overwhelmed since there's an announcement of the relief for those who are unemployed to receive some form of a grant in a form of 300 Rand a month. There are people who are outside there. We provided coffee for them. We are working with other organizations who are actually assisting us to provide food so that we can provide to people on the ground. We've also worked with some of the retail shops who are actually providing something. And people who are, have come up on board, I must say, with regards to those. But also, we are also educating people about the dangers of this virus and how it can be prevented. I must say that when somebody is hungry, when somebody is starving, it is difficult for them to social isolate or to live that social distance as a result of that, because what is in their mind is to get that food for the day. And as much as government at national level has had this instruction, there is some sort of a complete distraction or contradiction on the ground, where we find what committees, what councillors, people who are supposed to respond to people on the ground are not doing anything at all, if not taking the very same food that is meant for the poor, which in a form of food parcels, and selling them. I've had Comrade Pilani saying that the same happens in Zimbabwe, that partisan has been used in certain forms of distributing food. And I think social movements such as Social Justice Coalition, Abahlali baseMjondolo in Durban, we have seen them distributing food. We have seen the Khayelitsha can taking the task. These are young people who are risking their lives. These are young people who are confident, who are saying, we have been asked to stay in our homes. However, we are worried that the government who have said this, who have put down these rules, do not understand the day-to-day basics of somebody who's living in an informal settlement. Right now, there is a form of identification that the government has come up with to actually open up so that the spread of the virus is not that much. But our concern is that human rights violations might take place during this process. In our meeting with the Kosovo community, so if in the Western Cape, rather in Cape Town, 2 communities are going to be de-densified. That means there's a lot of people in informal settlement and people are living close to one another. So as a way of trying to curb the spread of this virus, the government has come up with rezoning and taking a certain number of people to certain places, about 2,000 to 1,000. 1,500 to 2,000 people in Kosovo and Danun are going to be relocated into new lands, portion of land. But there hasn't been any formal engagement or meaningful engagement with the people of the ground. But this is not a new phenomenon, because it's always been there when the government was supposed to respond to the crisis or to the need of the people. A government that has always been detached to the people does not consult and ensure that the people on the ground understand what rezoning means, what does de-densification means, what does it mean when somebody is moved from one place to another. So people in Kosovo, for instance, today we are going to have a meeting with the people in Danun to see what can be done to work together in ensuring that this process becomes smoothly and becomes democratic, because it seems like the ward councillors and the structures that are there put in by government are not doing that work. And I think the response by social movement is the only way, the key way right now that has been responsive to the need of the people on the ground. So the picture in Kosovo is that the people have not been consulted. They've heard it on the media, they've seen it on TV, they've seen the minister speaking, but there's never been any consultation with the people on the ground to say how this process is going to unfold, where are they going to be taken, and when are they going to come back to their place, or are they going to be put into formal housing after that, and how long are they going to stay in those temporary relocation. So those are some of the things that we are trying to assist the communities to say, well, this thing is out there and you are not being formally or meaningfully engaged about it. What are the risks and what can we do as social movement, working together with the community and trying to connect them with the minister. I mean, we've done that in Empolweni where there were evictions. Immediately after the court case, the interdict came out and preventing the municipality in Cape Town to actually continue the evictions. The Minister of Human Settlements came to Empolweni and spoke to the people and made promises. Some of them have not yet been fulfilled. That she was going to provide material for the people who have their homes been demolished. But however, the people have been protected now, but we've seen that there is now a communication between the city, the provincial government with regards to the particular community. And I think social movement, civil society, is the only weapon that is now is able to communicate with the people on the ground. My concern, though, is the recent announcement by the Social Development Minister, Minister Lindiwe Sisulu, when she said that before NGOs and social movement distribute food to the people on the ground, they must consult with the department. It must be consultative between the government and the NGOs. And my worry is that the response by the government, it takes very long. People are hungry now, people need food now, people are starving now, people are about to die because of starvation now. And if we are going to wait and try and wait for a state to respond to issues of the people on the ground when people on the ground are suffering and we are here as activists, we are going to have a crisis. And therefore, this is a concern. But nevertheless, we are working on the ground. We are ensuring that people's rights are not violated in the process. We are ensuring that there is meaningful engagement between the people and the government, because the government is by the people, for the people, and therefore the government should respond to the needs of the people by the way in which people want, because people, ordinary people, and there's a perception that poor people cannot think, cannot do things for themselves. And we think that working together with social movements on the ground, with communities, leaders on the ground, is the best way that a government can actually deal with the day-to-day issues that people are facing. But having said that, I think our government at national level is trying by all means to respond to this. But it's a concern. I mean, in the meeting that we've had recently in closing, there were issues about some of the employers, people sitting at home because they were found to be in contact with people who, or they've got symptoms of the virus, and they were told to stay at home, but it's no work, no pay. So they sit at home and they're still waiting for their results so that they can go back to work to see if they are cleared. And in that period, people are suffering. They are breadwinners in their homes. People are struggling, both in informal settlements. People in rural areas are struggling. But as I say, as I speak to you right now, the picture is gloom. We are doing all what we can to assist. And I think the idea of community action network has been very useful in working with the people, and the people on the ground are recognizing this and saying that if it wasn't for these young people, we would not have anything to eat. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Tapelo. That was a very moving and a very complex picture of all the different aspects of how this is unfolding. I'm very, in a way, one of the things you're bringing very clearly to the front is, on the one hand, this is a crisis where people are asked to take responsibility. The only way in which the virus is going to be combated is if everybody takes responsibility for their health and the well-being of those around them. And at the same time, we see a government response that very often seems to assume that people don't know what's good for themselves, and that acts in a paternalistic or a patronizing way, deciding for people what they should do and what they shouldn't do. I guess that is a tension everywhere. But one of the things that's been striking both in South Africa and in Zimbabwe is the attitude, either the hostility or the blind indifference of government to people in the informal sector. It's as if either government doesn't particularly care about the survival of those businesses, or perhaps it doesn't understand the importance and the workings of the informal sector. So our first question comes from Lawrence Piper, also an academic at the University of the Western Cape, and he's simply asking the question, I think all three of you might have thoughts about this: why do governments on both Zimbabwe and South Africa seem to ignore or repress the informal economy and people depending on the informal economy? Philani, what are your views?
Thank you, Lawrence. I think it has always been a complex issue. There are various reasons as to why states want to ignore or repress the informal sector. I think the first reason, obviously, is about the economic dimension to it. There is a thinking that they need more of the formal economy that is legible, that can be taxed, and therefore can be able to increase the state revenue. So this kind of shadow economy where the state is not able to tax the entirety of the informal sector is a big problem to the ruling elite. And the second aspect of it as well, talking more specifically about Zimbabwe, is the political dimension. There is a political dimension. This attempt to decimate the informal sector is not new. If you look historically, in 2005, the government had a campaign to drive out what they called filth, dirty, from the city centers, and about 700,000 people, according to the UN report, were actually driven off, who were in the informal sector. And the reason for that was that these were becoming centers for building political resistance and for opposing the government. So they had to be dealt away with. Also, you will see that electorally, the government of Zimbabwe has not been harvesting a lot from this informal sector. Then the third aspect, I think, is also a belief that sits with most of the state officials. They have this thinking that they must be able to see everything in straight lines. So if anything is not in straight lines, they don't consider it good enough. They don't consider it modern enough. They don't consider it as progress, which I would call an ideological reason. It's not necessarily scientific, but it's a kind of ideological faith on how perhaps the seat should look. Thank you.
Thank you, Pilan. Tapelo, what is your view on the blindness or apparent indifference of government to the importance of the economy and livelihoods in the informal economy?
Okay, thank you, Andres. I think one of the things that had happened during this crisis has been the fact that the state was awakened to see how people are surviving, because the most of the informal economy it is where people actually survive, because our unemployment rate is already high, and we have seen that when the minister the Minister of Cooperative Government announced that those who are selling hot food in Cape Town, around the country, can open during, I don't know whether it was the first, in the after we just reached when we were supposed to end the lockdown. People in Johannesburg went into the municipality trying to actually get these permits. In Cape Town, there was a confusion whether they should get it from the municipality or the ward councillor and so on. I think it's again a government who does not understand, in particular a local government, because that's where you have there's a crisis is, because what is happening is that informal economy relies on operations within the municipalities. So those who are selling fruit and vegetables will get permits from the municipalities. But what we have seen in Cape Town, for instance, is that law enforcement is used to actually tackle and abuse people who are selling on the street. And this is not new, and this is not as a result of COVID. So I think the state during this time has been awakened to the fact that people are surviving. This is a daily survival of people who are doing recycling, who are selling fruit and vegetables, who are opening shisanyama so that they could feed their families. People were reluctant to. People were very anxious to open after the lockdown was. They were told to open. But I think it is once again a government who does not understand. But because the informal economy is the only part where most of the people, our mothers and everyone, rely on, and there are people. We've seen a woman in Johannesburg during the lockdown being arrested for selling chakalaka, and this was a sign of a government who does not understand the day-to-day needs of the people on the ground and how people survive on the ground. And this woman said something. It's either I walk here and sell chakalaka and be arrested, or I sit at home and my children starve.
Thank you, Tapelo. So many interesting issues being raised, and unfortunately, we're already heading into the last 10 minutes of this webinar. But I want each of you to say a few words about a comment that we got in here from Karen Kleinboy, who makes the point that one of the key things that civil society should try to do is to enable ways in which people can speak back to the state, create a situation in which we are not merely the recipients of the regulation and orders, but how can we make sure that the right people in government hear the criticisms or the feedback that they need to hear, and perhaps start treating people more like citizens and less like subjects. I'm going to start with you, Fiona, and then I'm going to ask Tapelo and then Pilani to comment on this issue. Just what are you seeing about the ability of civil society to organize a two-way traffic of communication? Or are we just in a situation where we sit and wait for the live streaming broadcast in which we are addressed as fellow South Africans, and then we must just go on and do what the state tells us to do?
Thanks, Andres. Yeah, I think this points actually to quite a challenging issue at the moment because, again, I'll turn back to what our diarists have been saying. There's definitely still mobilization happening on the ground. I mean, everyone's talking about that and we're hearing those stories. But what we're not hearing stories about is the political role of ward councillors, for example, or the political role of traditional representatives who would be able to use the established formal channels to take back citizens' views. So if I had to answer this with my political science hat on, I'd be concerned. Really, I think formal democratic channels are just not operating the way that we need them to in any level of responsiveness. Yeah, ward councillors are there, but they're acting in a kind of survivalist mode. And what we're finding from our respondents, lots of comments about cans and civil society doing tasks of food and survival. And that is good and needed, and that in itself is a form of politics. But what it's not doing is translating it into a broader question of how do you generate direct action and how do you generate responsiveness from the state. So one of the ways this is happening is through the media, but the media is obviously going to be skewed, and it's going to have its challenges as to who's even reading that. How do we know? And so that's why we have a democracy, because that's what we're meant to rely on. We're meant to rely on these formal channels of communication through our representatives or through our officials. And I think part of the challenge, so what I want to just loop this back a little bit to look at the other question as well, is say I think part of the challenge is too many of our representatives and our officials who are meant to be these formal channels of responsiveness and engagement actually spend far too little of their time in very informal settings. And so my thinking around why is the state not dealing with the reality of the ground of what's happening in terms of the informal economy or how people and residents live in informal spaces is because I wonder sometimes if they actually know what that looks like or what that feels like, because it doesn't fit in to the silos and the structures. As I think Plan was saying, it doesn't work in the straight lines. It doesn't fit into the silos and structures of governance, the way local government's meant to work with its departments and its very specific mandates for its very specific sectors. And when you don't have when you've got a round peg in a square hole not fitting, it's easier to just try to steam all over it, or ignore it. So I think that's part of the challenge at the moment. So it really is going to be a moment of how civil society embraces new forms of direct action, would be my view, if they really want to influence government, because those spaces of participatory engagement seem to have closed down, or at least been redirected to more survivalist rather than structural issues.
Thank you, Fiona. Tapelo, what are your views on the spaces that exist, and what is your experience of success and failure in people speaking back to government and making your voices heard? Tapelo, I think you're muted. Could you unmute yourself?
Thank you very much. Is it? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, Tapelo. Please go ahead. Now you're muted again. You seem to be muting yourself. Oh, goodness me. We seem to be having difficulty with your sound, Tapelo. We're going to try to sort you out. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask whether we can go to Pilani to answer that question about speaking back to the state in the Zimbabwean context. But Tapelo, we want to return to you once we've got your sound sorted out. Pilani, your views, Zimbabwean perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I think I largely agree with Fiona's explanation. But I think in the Zimbabwean context, you need to invest in building a salubrious relationship between the state and civil society, because at the moment, the channels that exist are not effective to ensure that there is two-way communication. The state has its own fears. They think that the civil society is partisan. It is an extension of the neo-colonial and neo-imperial agenda, and is not willing to really work effectively with civil society, especially the civil society that deals with on trying to promote democracy and human rights. So those are some of the issues that we need to be looked at and try to address those before you have an effective two-way communication. But meanwhile, I think the kind of work that Fiona and others are doing, Sarah Jane, is very effective when you kind of have the lockdown diaries, when you kind of have like the videos from the communities talking directly, and try even to leverage on the media, though I know it's difficult, so that the community members can be able to talk more directly. I've noted that that has a huge impact in terms of making government officials listen to the needs of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Pilani. We're going to try one last time to go back to Tapelo. Tapelo, I asked you whether people can make themselves audible to the state, but we appear to struggle to hear you. Let's see if we can unmute your microphone and hear your views.
Am I able to reach out to you guys now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think in South Africa we are not in that crisis. I think one of the reasons that we are that has the problem that is existing in South Africa is that we have political parties who want to rise above and be seen as the only political parties that come up with a solution. I mean, you have a government at national level that is communicating with a government at a provincial level in the Western Cape, which these are two political parties. As a result, people who are living in Khayelitsha, because their ward councillor is an ANC member, and I mean is ANC, and then the municipality is run by the Democratic Alliance, and the message comes from an ANC government to a provincial government that is run by the DA, and you find that there's political issues that are playing themselves, but at the end of the day, it is the people on the ground that know nothing about politics, the people that only need bread to go on their table so that they could sleep better. It's only people who are suffering are the people who in the informal settlements, people who are struggling, people whose children starve as a result of this political interference. And I think if we can break that and say this is a crisis, it's not a DA crisis, it's not an ANC crisis, it's a crisis for every South African, it's a crisis for all of us. If anyone comes up with a solution, let's listen to that solution. It doesn't have to come to anyone else. And break it down, every community, poor community in Khayelitsha, everywhere in South Africa, informal, township, anywhere else, there is a structure, a civic structure, which is a structure that is non-political, that can be engaged and can represent people at ordinary. If we can have communication between those structures as a whole at a government level, so that you communicate with structures that are not politically aligned, so that when their food parcels that to be delivered are not delivered to ANC members only or Democratic Alliance members only, but getting all the structures that already exist, whether it's street committees, whether it's ward committees, whether it's civic organizations, the development organizations that are existing in the communities, so that we get to the root of the people on the ground, because that's what we need at this point in time, so that we don't become attached. We have the resources are there, but they are not getting to the right people that need them. People are aspiring and using them to actually sell them, corrupt, and do other things. But if there's communication with those structures and people understand the processes, it will be much better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tapelo. That was a really stirring reminder of what is at stake in this crisis, which is truly a crisis about the politics of life, the biopolitics of who does the state invest in so that they can live, and who is allowed to die. We are sitting in a country in South Africa, at least, where the constitution starts with the word that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And yet we've seen that this pandemic impacts so unequally in different sectors of society. Some people are taken care of and others feel abandoned. Some people are heard and others are not. Some people get to write open letters to the president, and others sit in their shacks and are ignored by their ward councillor. So I have the feeling that we have not reached the end of this road yet, but we have come to the end of this webinar. Thank you very much for your thought-provoking and your powerful presentations. It's time to say goodbye. Next week, we will return to the bread and butter issues of hunger and food security when we look at what's happening to food prices on the ground in the corona crisis. But until then, thank you very much for listening. Thank you for participating, and stay safe, wash your hands, and don't forget to be citizens of a democratic state wherever you are. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Stay safe.